Hi, I'm Lelia Lewis, and welcome to another edition of Building a Better You. Now, today we're going to be reading from the book of Genesis, but we're going to be reading from chapter 37 and 39 and 40 and 41, but they all come together to create our story. And this is a story of a young boy who became a great ruler in Egypt. Why? Because he never lost his faith in God. And I'm speaking about Joseph. Joseph was the son of Jacob. Now, Jacob, his father, had 3 wives, which gave Joseph 11 brothers. But even so, Father Jacob, he loved Joseph more than all of his other sons. And he loved him because he was the son of his old age. And because of that, he made him a coat, a beautiful coat, a multicolored coat of reds and blues and greens and yellows. And in the Bible, it's called the coat of many colors. And we're going to talk about that, and we're going to see how it, along with the love of his father, kind of got him a bad rep, they might say, with his brothers. So let's go to chapter 37, and we're going to start in verse 4. And we're going to read a few of these verses, and we're going to stop and talk about that. Verse 4 says, Now when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of them, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably unto him. That means they didn't have a good word to say to him at any time. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and then they hated him even more. And this was the dream, he said to them, behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and my sheaf arose, and it stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. Well, that means your sheaves were bowing down to me in obedience. And his brother said, Oh, so shalt thou indeed reign over us? Or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And later he came back to them again and he said, I've had another dream. And I dreamed this time that the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obedience to me. But this time he told that to his father as well as his brothers. But his father, he was kind of annoyed, and his father, it says, rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall now I and thy mother and thy brother indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee, to the earth? And his brothers envied him. But his father observed what he had said. So that means that even though it irritated the father and he kind of had disapproval, that's what rebuked means. He kind of disapproved of how could you have this kind of dream where your mother and I and then your brothers all bow down before you. But the brothers, they were very envious. But it says the father observed what he said. That means he thought about it. He thought about what he said. But in the meantime, the father had sent the other brothers out to Shechem to feed the flock and take care of the flock. But he says to Joseph, he said, Well, go out there and see how they're doing with the flock and come back and give me a good report. So let's flip over to verse 18. Now, verse 18 says, and when they, his brothers, saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. Now already they're seeing him at a distance, but they're already scheming and conniving on how they can kill him. So they said one to the other, he says, oh look, here comes the dreamer. Come now, let us slay him and cast him into some pit. And then we'll just say some evil beast has devoured him, and we'll see what will become of his dreams then. But Reuben, one of his brothers, heard this, and Reuben wasn't in tune with the slaying thing. So Reuben was trying to think of a way to save Joseph's life, even in hopes that maybe someday he might return to his father. So in the meantime, they threw him in the pit. Let's read to verse 27. They threw him in the pit because then they said, look, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. Then our hands will be clean. We don't have to kill him. Let's sell him. So the Ishmaelites came and they sold him for 20 pieces of silver. And the Ishmaelites took Joseph into Egypt to become a slave. Now, let's look at verse 29, because it says, when Reuben came back, because he didn't want to be bothered with any of this, so he kind of walked away, and he came back and he looked in the pit and he said, well, where is he? What are we going to do now? So they took Joseph's coat, because they stripped him of his coat before they even threw him in the pit, because this was part of their plan. So they showed him, look, we have his coat. We're going to kill a baby goat, and we're going to dip his coat in the blood. Then we can say, a beast got him. We'll take it back to our father, and we'll just say, this is what we found. Is this thy son's coat? And verse 33 says, and he knew it, Jacob. He knew it was his son's coat, and he said, it is my son's coat. And they said, an evil beast hath devoured him. And the boys said, oh, father, Joseph is without doubt rent into pieces. And that means ripped into shreds by an animal. And Jacob rent his clothes. That means he was so sorrowful, he ripped his clothes and put a sackcloth on. And he mourned for his son for many days. Because when they have a funeral or somebody dies, that's their way of mourning. That's what they do. They rip their clothes, they put dirt in their hair, and they mourn. And no matter what, nobody in the family could console Jacob. And he wept for many days for his son Joseph. And in the meantime, Joseph was sold in Egypt, but he was sold to Potiphar. And Potiphar, he was working for, Potiphar was the officer of the Pharaoh. And he was the captain of Pharaoh's guard. So once Joseph was sold to Potiphar, let's go to verse 39 and see what happens to his life going forward. We're going to chapter 39, and we're going to look at verse 2. So now Joseph is in the house of Potiphar, and he's working there. And it says, but the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And Joseph found grace in the sight of him, and he served him. And Potiphar made him overseer over his entire house. He put everything in his hands. And it came to pass, from the time that he made Joseph overseer, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in his house and in his field. In his house and in his field. So now Joseph is in a great position. This is just to go show you how his faith, he never lost faith in God. God's continually promoting him, even through other people. Now in chapter 39, it gets a little sticky because now Potiphar's wife had an eye for Joseph, but Joseph was very strict in his beliefs and his loyalties. And she kept trying to get Joseph to come into her room, come into her room. And he said, no, I cannot do that. I cannot do that wicked thing in the eyes of my God. And this kind of made her kind of angry. So what happened was, let's go to verse 14. So now that Joseph wouldn't come into her room, he went past her down the hall, and she grabbed his robe, trying to pull him in, and he wiggled out of his robe and ran away. He fled, as they say. He left the robe and fled. So now that she has the robe, she had the garment in her hand. Now she's going to turn the tables. So she turns around and calls out to the other men like she's crying out for help. And when they came to see why she was crying out, she says, see what my husband has brought in, a Hebrew unto us, to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and that's why I cried out in a loud voice. And then when I cried out, he left his garment with me and he fled. Well, how untrue is that? So she flipped the whole script and made Joseph at fault. So let's go to verse 16. And verse 16 says, she laid the garment beside her until Potiphar came home. And she told him the exact same thing. She said, the Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And I cried out with a loud voice, and he left his garment with me and he fled. Well, that kind of made Potiphar angry, and it did say that his words, he was wrath. He was kindled with wrath. That means he became extremely angry. So let's go to verse 20. And verse 20 says, and Joseph's master then took him and put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound. But again, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in sight of the keeper of the prison. And at that point, the keeper of the prison made Joseph be over all the other prisoners. So whatever they did, Joseph was now responsible for them. And the keeper of the prison looked upon Joseph with favor because the Lord was with him. And anything that he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So now let's go to chapter 40. Because now we're seeing no matter what happens to Joseph, he always has God's favor. So we're in verse 40. Now, while he was in prison, two other people were put in prison. And that was the chief baker and the chief butler. And they were put into prison with Joseph. So they both had a dream on the exact same night. But the next morning, when Joseph awakened and went to see them, they were looking so sad. They were looking very sad. And Joseph said to them, "Well, why are you so sad?" And let's go to verse 8. Let's read about this because this is the part where Joseph interprets their dream. And they said unto him, "We both had a dream, but there's no one here to interpret it for us." And Joseph said unto them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me." So the chief butler told him his dream, and he said, "Behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine there were three branches, and it budded, and the blossoms shot forth, and clusters brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup to Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said, "That means there were three branches, means 3 days. Yet within those 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore to thee thy place. And thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hands, just as you did before." Just as you did before. But now what happened? So when the baker heard, how great that was, let's go and read verse 16. Because now the baker, he wanted to have him read interpret his dream. But Joseph had already said to the butler, "Now, when you get out, don't forget me. Remember me. Mention me to Pharaoh so that I can get out of this awful place as well." Okay, so now he's going to read and listen to the baker's dream. And the baker said unto Joseph, "I also had a dream, and I had three white baskets on my head." And Joseph answered, but then he said, "But the birds came and ate out of the baskets that were upon my head, and they ate everything out of the basket." And Joseph said, "This means this of your dream. There were three baskets, and there will be 3 days. Yet within these 3 days the Pharaoh shall lift thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat of thy flesh off the tree." And it came to pass, the third day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he did make a feast, and he did lift up the chief butler, and he did lift up the chief baker, and he did restore the butler to his butlership, and the butler did give cup to Pharaoh's hand. But he did hang the chief baker, just as Joseph had interpreted. Just as Joseph had said, he hung the chief butler. And now we're going to go to verse 41. But now he returned the butler back to his place, but at the same time, what happened? The butler forgot about Joseph. He didn't think about Joseph until he saw that the baker was hung. But this happened like 2 years. Joseph had to stay in prison 2 more years after the butler had left because he had forgotten about him. He had forgotten about him. But at this particular time, Pharaoh himself was having a dream. And he was troubled, and he called all his magicians and all the wise men, but nobody could interpret his dream. Now the chief butler remembers, he remembers Joseph. There was Joseph. He was in the prison when I was there, and he interpreted my dream and the baker's dream. So Pharaoh now he's calling for Joseph. He's sending for Joseph. Now let's go to verse 15 and 16 of chapter 41. 15 and 16 of chapter 41. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I've had this dream, but nobody can interpret it. But I've heard about you, and they say you can. And Joseph answered the Pharaoh and said, It is not me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. He said, It's not me, it's God. It's God. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Here's my dream. I stood on the bank of the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, Kine, and that means cows. 7 cows, fat, fresh, and well favored. And they fed in the meadow. And behold, 7 other cows came up after them, but they were very poor and ill favored and very lean. But those 7 ate up the fat ones. And I saw another dream. There was 7 stalks of ears of corn came from one stalk, and they were full. But then there were 7 ears that were withered and thin. They came up after them. But the thin ears devoured the good ears. But nobody could tell me what it meant. And Joseph said, God is showing Pharaoh what he is about to do. And that means the 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears of corn are 7 good years. But the 7 ill-fated devoured kine and the 7 withered ears mean famine. So that means you have to find somebody that can oversee the Egyptians to show them how to store up food to last them for the famine, but have enough food stored up during the good years for the famine. So what happens next? Now, verse 39 says, Now they appointed Pharaoh appointed Joseph to be that man, because he said, There is none any wiser. There is none that can do what you have done. You are a man that's discreet and wise, for I see what the Lord has done for you. So after that, Joseph showed them how to store up for the 7 years and how to have enough when the famine came. So let's go to verse 56, because now it's going to tell us when the 7 years were over and the years of famine came, everyone, all the countries came over to buy from Egypt, from Joseph, because he was the only one that taught the Egyptians how to store up. So he opened the warehouses and sold to the Egyptians and to all the countries that came to Egypt to buy. All the countries that came to Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Now you notice all this means one thing, that no matter what situation Joseph was in, it always said what? And the Lord was with him. Why? Because he trusted and believed in God. And everyone that served him, everyone that had favor for Joseph, they got the same blessings because of Joseph. And everyone he served found favor with him. And he got assigned to all those wonderful positions. Why? Because he trusted in God. And it all comes back to 3 things: trusting, believing, and obeying God. So everything that Joseph did, those three things, that's what gave him the wonderful blessings of his Lord. And I say all that to say that we can use those same measures to get the same blessings, no matter what our situation is, trusting, believing, and obeying. And I want to share with you now the poem that I wrote, and it's called The Sacrifice. I can't imagine seeing Jesus on that cross. What a horrible sight that would be, just to see him endure such excruciating pain. And he did it all for you and for me. There he was with his arms stretched wide, his life he was willing to give. And he did it all to bear our sins, so eternal life we could live. Are we doing all we can show him that his sacrifice wasn't in vain? Do we wake up each day with thanksgiving, singing praises to his holy name? If you're not, I just want to remind you, it didn't have to be this way. But now that you know the real story, make him first in your life every day. Do what Joseph did. Trust, obey, and believe. Hold on to God's unchanging hand. Because no matter what you think or what you feel, the only thing that you need to remember is nothing is impossible through God. Follow Joseph's way, your outcome will be the same because nothing is impossible for God. So at this point, I'm going to ask you. Now, God can do the same for you. I'm asking you, would you be willing to trust him? Would you put your hand into his hand? Would you follow his lead? Are you willing to follow his lead? Are you willing to continue to read his word, to understand and be patient with his decision? It's still all about choices. It's still all about reading. You can't understand if you're not reading. And you're not reading, so you're not understanding. So all this goes hand in hand. All the things. What could be worse than being in prison for something you didn't do? What could be worse than being thrown? Can you imagine being thrown into a pit? Who does that? What's it like to have your own family, your brothers, your siblings, to hate you that much? They want to destroy you. But yet, no matter what anybody tried to do, God protected him, he guided him, and he never lost faith in his God. And even when Pharaoh's wife lied about him out of anger because he wouldn't do what she wanted, even then, Pharaoh didn't put him to death because that's what she thought he was going to do. But Pharaoh, for some reason, he still had that faith in Joseph, even though he thought he was betrayed. That's why he put him in prison. But even in prison, Joseph was lifted up by God. God's blessings will always follow you. And my closing words for today are, God's blessings follow those who follow him. And until next week, I'm Lelia Lewis. Thanks for joining me.